Welcome to interviewer training. During this video, we'll be covering what you need to do as an interviewer, what you need to be aware of and mindful of, and what you should not do as an interviewer. By the end of this video, you'll know how to legally conduct an interview to determine if an applicant's qualifications meet the needs of our county. We want to make sure we're hiring the best candidate for the position we're looking to fill. Here's a quick overview of the process. Most of these steps are managed by the hiring manager, and as an interviewer, you don't need to know the ins and outs of how this works. Sometimes the hiring manager will ask you to take a look at the interviewer questions to get feedback, or on occasion, ask you to help review the pool with them. But generally, your participation will be limited to the interviews themselves. We do ask structured interview questions on the vast majority of our interviews. Structured interview questions are selected in advance. On occasion, we'll use activities, role players, or other techniques, and if you're evaluating a process that includes one of these, please be sure to ask questions on what your role is if you're unclear. On the day of the interviews, you'll want to take a look at the job description, especially for a position that you might not be as familiar with. You'll also want to review the applications and any supplemental material the candidates have submitted. Generally, the hiring manager for the position will provide this information to you either the day of the interview or in advance of the interview. As you're reviewing the candidate's materials, make note of things that you might want to know more about or questions you might want to ask. You'll want to cross-reference the structured questions to see if they're getting at your questions. If not, either beforehand or on that morning before you start, you can ask if there's some time to fit in some additional questions, or in reviewing the set questions, see if there's a way to add a follow-up question into the set questions. You will need to ask the same questions of all the candidates. That's why it's important to review the materials before you begin. Pay particular attention during your first candidate's interview. You may come up with a general follow-up question during that interview, and then you may ask it for all of the subsequent interviews. It's important to ask the same general follow-up questions of all the candidates. This doesn't mean you can't ask follow-up questions specific to the candidate and what they're saying. What you want to be sure of is that you've given each candidate the opportunity to respond to all of your general follow-up questions. Once the candidates start coming in, usually the hiring manager will give an overview of the process, and then you'll begin asking the structured questions. Often, interviewers will take turns asking questions around the table. Be sure to ask for clarification if it's not clear. Once we have asked the candidate our questions, we allow the candidates to ask their own questions, conclude, thank, and then repeat. Couple of things to keep in mind on the day of your interview. We recommend, while you're in the moment, take all of the answers in isolation. Don't allow observations or evaluations from one answer to influence another. This is because sometimes the way a question is worded, or as a candidate becomes more comfortable with the panel, he or she may become a stronger interview. So take each answer in isolation, and then at the end of the interview, look at the entire picture. You want to listen for what a candidate doesn't say just as much as what they are saying. We're going to be talking about listening for the ears shortly, but for example, candidates may use the royal we. We did this great, amazing thing. It was awesome. The follow-up question is, what did you do? What was your role in it? You want to listen for those kinds of cues and then ask the appropriate follow-up question. Don't advise on how well a candidate is doing using strong emotions through the interview. We don't want to imply any contracts, so none of this, "Are you sure this is what you want to do with your life?" Or, "You're awesome! You're a shoo-in for this position. We'd be stupid not to pick you." Don't do those things. It's okay to smile, it's okay to laugh, but just don't imply anything throughout the interview. Pauses are okay. For someone like me, who's an extreme extrovert, this is something I have to keep in mind. The recommendation is to count 3 to 5 seconds between asking the question and letting the person answer. It's okay to count in your head sometimes. Let's try this. I'm sure that felt very long. Sometimes we want to reflexively ask a follow-up question and rephrase the question right away. Don't do that. You have to let it sit because some people just need that time to formulate their answer before they respond. It can feel really long in an interview. Of course, if it goes longer than 3 to 5 seconds, then repeat, rephrase if needed. Good etiquette. Remember that the candidate is interviewing us as an employer as well as us interviewing them as an employee. So hold the interviews in a private area, free of interruptions. Let the candidate do most of the talking. Keep in mind that we don't ask questions we already know the answer to. If there's something we should know from the application or through some other part of the process, we don't ask during the interview. We want to maximize this time with the candidate to get information we don't already have. You want to also have a sense of the vacancy and ask the hiring manager, what are the look-fors? What's your model answer? What are the sort of things you hope to hear from a great candidate? You need to ask the hiring manager about what type of candidate he or she needs. For example, take a general leadership question. It doesn't tell you if they're looking for a change agent or a continuity leader, or someone who's a leader amongst peers versus a supervisory leader. You want to have a sense of what kind of leadership the position needs. What is the hiring manager looking for this position at this time that fits the needs of the department or division for this hire? And of course, relax. This is way harder for them than it's likely going to be for you. Tips for success. We recommend writing down direct phrases as much as you can. There's a lot of information all at once, so depending on how many people you're going to interview, they can start blurring together a bit on who said what. So writing down things like good answer becomes less useful when you've got 7 good answers in a row. We also recommend direct phrases because sometimes when you paraphrase, you end up saying the general gist of the thing, but later on someone might end up saying something very similar, and it's hard to compare who said it better or who actually answered all the pieces of the question, who gave the fuller answer, which is why direct quotes are a good way to go if you can. It's okay to use a separate sheet of paper to supplement your interview notes. Underline key points throughout your notes. And be sure to check answers against the indicators or against the model answer. Going back to our leadership example, someone can give a great answer about how they perform as a change agent, but if what you really needed was a continuity leader, that's not a great fit. Or sometimes someone can tell a great story that's engaging and interesting and an amazing example of the person's abilities, but has nothing whatsoever to do with the question you asked. We want to exercise basic professionalism through this process, so be on time, dress appropriately, be prepared, approach the interview positively and with an open mind. Remember, you were selected for a reason. We want you to take the role seriously, and you wouldn't have been asked to be on the panel if your judgment and participation in the process wasn't important. This is a big time commitment and a big responsibility with real effects for our county. Taking control. A lot of times the hiring manager takes this role, but interview panelists can do it as well. Your interviews are usually on a tight schedule. One of the things we recommend, if possible, is to have 2 clocks in the interview room, one that the panel can see and one that the candidate can see. We find that if a candidate can see a clock and knows what the time frame is, they're much more likely to self-regulate their time. So you can preface the interview with, this is a 1-hour interview. We have 10 questions to go through. Usually candidates will start monitoring themselves. But if they don't, you've got to rein them in. One of the best tools to use, especially once they've already answered the question and they're starting to ramble, is when they take a breath, say, thank you. Because they'll usually pause to listen to what you have to say beyond the thank you, and you can move to the next question. You might have to give the candidates updates throughout, especially as you get towards the end. Even if they feel that they haven't fully answered a question, but they've answered fully a lot of the other questions, you may have to at some point say, "That's great, but we only have 30 minutes left, and we want to move on to the next question, so you have a chance to answer all of our questions." Be prepared to gently guide candidates back who go off tangent. You'll hear this a lot when someone starts to philosophize. For example, when you ask a question like, "Give us an example of when you were a good leader," the candidate may start to say, "Well, the role of a leader is da 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 da," or "Participatory managers are da 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 da," and they start to sound like a philosophy teacher when you really just wanted an example of when they had been a good leader. So you need to bring them back in. That's the time to wait for that pause, insert a thank you or "Great, can you give us an example when you did this?" Or "When you were a participatory leader, can you tell us about a specific instance?" If you have someone who has a habit of going off tangent and you ask these follow-up questions from the start, they'll get the picture by mid-interview and they'll think to themselves, "Oh, that's right, you wanted an example of when I actually did this." How long an interview lasts all depends on the candidate. Some interviews will go by very quickly and you'll end up with 20 minutes left. Or some will get so close that you watch the clock ticking by. "Oh no, we're 5 minutes past. Oh no, we're approaching 10 minutes past." The goal is to get through all of the questions for all of the candidates in roughly the same amount of time. And the important part is to get through all of the questions, because some people give better answers to some questions compared to others. Listening for the ears. We're big believers that the best predictor of future behavior is past behavior. So we ask a lot of behavior-based questions, which are structured on what you've done in the past to indicate how you might respond in the future. These are those "tell me about a time when" type of questions. What you want to listen for when you're asking these types of questions are the ear. E is the event, what happened, what was the event. So when someone is sounding like a philosophy teacher, that's when they're missing the event. They're talking about the topic as opposed to an actual incident. A is the action. What was your role? That's the royal we you'll be listening for. We did this amazing thing. Okay, what was your role in the amazing thing? What did you do? Were you guiding it? Was it your idea? Were you the chair? And so forth. R is the result. What happened? What was the outcome? You can have interviews where the event is awesome and the role that the candidate had was head of the amazing and awesome thing. And it was that candidate's amazing and awesome thing. But at the end, you can ask, "Well, what happened with the amazing and awesome thing?" And the answer is, "Well, it just started 2 weeks ago, so we don't know yet." So you want to keep in mind, listen for the ears. Legal versus illegal. No, you can't ask anything you want. And yes, it does have to relate to the job. There's a number of laws. We're going to go through them all briefly. Why do we have to be mindful of how we're asking questions? Well, we want to avoid penalties and lawsuits, but more importantly, we want to be consistent and fair to all of our candidates. Interviews are a snapshot of a person, and we want to give everyone the same opportunity to show us their best selves. Lastly, keep in mind that we do keep all of the notes related to the interview process for 3 years. So don't take notes that can be perceived as being illegal, such as the woman in the red dress or the guy in the wheelchair. Just remember people's names and faces. Title VII of the Civil Rights Act. This prohibits discrimination on the basis of race, color, sex, religion, or national origin. It also prohibits retaliation. What this means is that we don't make any employment decisions based on these factors. The Americans with Disabilities Act extends protected class protection to those who have or are regarded as having a physical or mental disability. The important thing to keep in mind with the ADA is that we're required to provide reasonable accommodation for physical or mental limitations unless it would cause us an undue hardship. That's for both our employees and our applicants. This doesn't typically come up during interviews. Usually it occurs either at hire, when details of the job are being discussed, or before some kind of testing, like through our public safety processes, which contain physical agility or written testing components. What you need to know is that if someone says, I have this physical or mental limitation, I need some help or accommodation, that should be a trigger. If they say it in terms of what's going on in the recruitment process, then the hiring manager will have to call HR to discuss whether or not we can make that accommodation. If it's something to do with being on the job, we usually wait to see if the candidate is our top candidate before having that discussion. But again, the hiring manager will call HR. Now, sometimes you have a candidate who has an obvious limitation. A great example is for a manual labor job if someone is in a wheelchair. You may want to ask if they can do the job. Don't ask. Again, whether we can make an accommodation happens after the interview process if they're the top candidate. Otherwise, we don't take it into consideration. Even if it's not obvious, if someone brings up something, we don't ask about whether they will need an accommodation. What we can ask, and if you do ask it, it should be to all candidates as a set interview question, is the only yes/no question you'll get. It's, here's the job description, or you've had an opportunity to review the job description. Can you do this job with or without a reasonable accommodation? If it's no, then they can't do the job. But if it's yes, even if it's yes with an accommodation, that's a conversation to be had if they're the top candidate. And HR will have that conversation with the hiring manager and the candidate about what kind of accommodations we can offer. Also, we can't ask about any medical-related information. That's prohibited at the interview stage. The Pregnancy Discrimination Act extends the ADA. It's not that being pregnant is a disability, it's that the effects of the pregnancy are the disability. But we treat it in the same way as any other disability. We don't ask questions about it until after the interview process if they're the best candidate. Age Discrimination and Employment Act. This prohibits discrimination against anyone over 40, and actually is extended by a Virginia law to protect anyone over 18. Really, we don't care how old anyone is, unless there's some statutory limitation, like with police officers. For police officers in Virginia, you need to be 21 or older to conceal carry a handgun. And under our retirement system for this position, there's a mandatory retirement age of 70. But we pre-screen that information through our background process or our application process, so you as an interview panelist should never have to worry about age limitations. So here's an overview of all the things you shouldn't ask about. I'm going to sound a little like a college degree infomercial, so bear with me. Don't ask about race, color, height, weight, sex, sexual preference, age, disabilities, whether physical or mental, creed or religious affirmation, national origin, ancestry, marital or familial status, or really anything at all that has nothing to do with the job. You want to ask job-related questions throughout our interview process. One final piece to legal versus illegal, volunteered information. So you could have excellent questions and everything's job-related, and you can ask a very general leadership question where a candidate responds that their leadership example is that they're a youth minister. You might think, oh no, religion. It's okay. Don't worry, it's volunteered information. What you want to do is make sure you're not basing any of your decisions on that volunteered information, that you're not discriminating based on someone's membership in a protected class. That also doesn't mean you can't ask follow-up questions. What you don't do is don't ask, oh, what church are you youth minister at? Or what denomination are you? Instead, you ask questions about the leadership component of their answer. What leadership skills have you learned through that work? Or how long have you been doing that kind of leadership work? Those are the kinds of job-related follow-up questions you can ask. Okay, switching gears, we're going to talk about bias. Unconscious or unintentional bias are the most difficult to identify, but can cause a lot of turmoil. For example, following Hurricane Katrina in 2005, two now infamous photos were published by the media. What made these photos infamous? A single word in their caption. Let's see if you catch it. So in this first image, a young man walks through chest-deep floodwater after looting a grocery store in New Orleans on Tuesday, August 30th, 2005. Floodwaters continued to rise in New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina did extensive damage when it made landfall on Monday. And here in our second image, two residents wade through chest-deep water after finding bread and soda from a local grocery store after Hurricane Katrina came through the area in New Orleans, Louisiana. So here's a side-by-side view of those images and captions. The use of the word looting on the left versus finding on the right have led to numerous discourse on unconscious bias. To be fair, these two pictures are taken by different people with different news organizations. One is from the AP, Associated Press, which is an American-based international news organization, and the other is from the AFP, the Agence France Presse, which is a French-based international news organization. So what are biases? Biases are learned associations that can exist outside of our conscious awareness or control. How do you become aware of your unconscious or unintentional biases? Well, first, know that they exist and know that you have them to a degree. We're all influenced by our life experiences, our culture, our gender, our race, our age, even what order of birth we are relative to our siblings, if we have siblings. The list goes on. We all bring ourselves and our experiences with us as an interviewer. You've been asked to be an interviewer in part because of your experiences and what you know about the position you're interviewing for or the perspective you bring. But unconscious biases reflect learned associations that exist outside of our awareness or control. And we can't determine if one of our biases is untrue or unsupported unless we know what they are. So your first step is to be aware of your biases. Be self-reflective to make unconscious biases become acknowledged biases. Next, examine your own assumptions. For example, consider this statement. Older candidates are likely to retire soon and leave their job in a few years, so they're generally not the best choice. Or, people who have multiple jobs for less than 5 years are unstable. Actually, both of these assumptions are no longer valid assumptions. In fact, the average tenure with the same employer for men and women of all ages is now 3 to 5 years, according to the U.S. Department of Labor Statistics. Here's another one. Non-traditional piercings, hair, or attire is uncalled for in any work environment. Now, if you've got a pre-stated dress code that was issued for the interview, that's one thing. But if it's a general interview, be mindful that there's a difference between someone who's a stickler about wearing a suit with a tie, or for women, wearing a suit with a suit skirt and not pants, versus wearing jeans and a t-shirt for a traditional office associate type job. Test your assumptions through others, especially people who come from different backgrounds. Ask them about your assumptions. Or ask HR to help test your assumptions. Or test your assumptions on your own by meeting new people. And finally, be mindful of the like me principle. For example, consider this. People who went to my alma mater versus someone who went to a rival school or who went to an online school are better situated because they were well trained. Accreditations, certifications, these can change for a school over time. And at the end of the day, it's not about the school, it's about what someone learned from that experience. So if there's a candidate you identify with who has similar life experiences, that might make you more favorably inclined or disinclined if they have different experiences. It's something to be aware of and actively think about whether your biases are affecting your judgment positively or negatively. You want to ask open-ended questions. Stay away from those yes/no questions, except for the can you perform this job with or without a reasonable accommodation one. Sometimes you need to ask candidates for more information with follow-up questions. Remember that follow-up questions also need to meet those legal guidelines. And for consistency's sake, you need to ask general follow-up questions starting with the first candidate. For instance, if you're asking a leadership question, you may end up wanting to ask the follow-up question, given what you've described, how do you know if you're a successful leader? Since that's a general question, you want to ask it of all of the subsequent candidates. So remember to review those questions before you begin and to be thinking about follow-up questions, especially through the first interview. It's possible through the natural rhythm of the interview that you come up with follow-up questions. Make a note so that you can ask it of all of your candidates. Now, this only applies to general follow-up questions. For specific follow-up questions, you can ask that for individual candidates. Another thing you may want to keep in mind as you're reviewing interview questions is, do you need to ask any contrary evidence follow-up questions? What that is if you're asking a bunch of questions like, tell me about this horrible incident and how you fixed it or dealt with it. And you might want to ask the opposite of that, which is, tell me about something awesome that happened and how amazing it was. Trying to make sure that your questions are balanced and you're trying to get at both sides of the thing. Sometimes people don't get a lot of opportunity to see a lot of controversy in their work, but they've had awesome jobs with awesome opportunities and they've gained skills from that experience that would be relevant to the position at hand. Now, I've given you a lot of tips on follow-up questions, but you also need to keep in mind how much time you have for the interview. Some interviews are going to be structured too tightly to allow for many follow-up questions. So talk to your hiring manager about how much time you may have to ask questions, or if some of these questions may be better suited for a next round. Decision making. So you've talked to all of your candidates, and now it's time to make a decision. First, make sure you understand the base bar in terms of qualities or characteristics that someone will have to be successful at this job. What is that baseline, and what do you absolutely need this person to be able to do? Ask the hiring manager questions to help you understand this piece. If all of the candidates are below that minimum level, it doesn't matter how well they stack up against each other. If they can't do the minimum of what's needed, we'll have to go back out. Once you've determined who's above the bar, then you can compare them against each other. Keep in mind those look-fors that you discussed with the hiring manager. A candidate might be amazing, but not the right fit for this job. Keep in mind what the needs are. Like with the leadership example earlier, you could have a stellar change agent, but if you need a continuity leader, that's not the right fit. Depending on the interview process, such as how many interviews are scheduled or the timeline of the decision, the hiring manager may just want comments, may want you to rank the candidates, or may want the panel to reach some consensus on who to move forward. Each process can be a little different, so ask for clarity if you're not sure. If there's a point scoring, generally we recommend having a discussion about the answers first, because some people might catch something you didn't hear or have interpreted an answer differently. Usually for our point scoring interviews, once you discuss, you make your own judgment on what score to give each candidate. And the other piece of decision making is bias. Like the career 3 to 5 year bias mentioned earlier, We want to try to check those biases as best we can before making a decision. Confidentiality. Remember, this is a small town, and odds are the industry or position you're interviewing for is even smaller. So be mindful about not sharing people's names. Just because someone is interviewing does not mean that they're unhappy with where they are. They might just be looking for a different experience. So we do want to keep everything confidential in terms of names, how people answer questions, and so forth. Remember, the best predictor of future behavior is past behavior. One other thing, we've got listed on the bottom of this page our employee resources site, which contains a workforce planning page. It's got a lot of information, including an overview of the recruiting process, manuals, checklists. It's got a bunch of sample interview questions that hiring managers can use, and our employees can use it to prep for interviews as well. It also contains an interviewing refresher link in case you try to think back about what you listened to during this video and it's a little foggy. Okay, got it all? Because there is a quiz at the end of this video, and you'll need to complete the interviewer training quiz before you're officially done. Thank you.